Did you know the wind was blowing? A little bit. I pulled into your parking lot and I saw some cars parked out here, and they backed into their spaces. I'm trying to figure out why they did that. If it's so the sun doesn't shine on the dashboard, or if the wind doesn't blow the door open when you get out, or if it's a quick getaway. That's kind of what I was wondering, if you guys kind of leave really quick and you're a quick getaway. So I want some ushers at the doors to hold them till I'm done. Pastor gave me 2 bottles of water, so it's going to be a double header today. It's going to be a good time, and it's good to be here. Is this okay? You hear me all right? All right. Bless the Lord. You guys know what today is? What's the date today?
March 4th.
It's March 4th. It's the only day of the year that's a command. March 4th. So that's what you're going to do today. That's what God has called us to do. He's called us to March 4th. So whatever God's placed in your hand, the work that He's placed for you to do, I want you to commit it to the Lord and say, Lord, I'm willing. If you give me the calling, if you ask me to do it, I will march forth and do what you ask me to do. Amen? Amen. Let's start. My name is Dan Zitterkoff. It's my wife, Libby. I want to just take a moment and introduce her. You can clap for her. She's amazing. She's what keeps me together. Be sure to take a little time to visit with her afterwards as well. Not during the service, not while I'm talking, but later. Bless the Lord. Pastor Tim and Karen and family, I just want to thank you for giving me an opportunity to be here today in Falls City. And this is my first time in Falls City. Lord willing, it won't be my last, but it's good to be with you here this morning. There was a ministry that was established in 1941 that has impacted the spiritual life of literally thousands of people over 75 plus years, several generations. Over the years, they developed a large campus, a large facility, multiple facilities that depended on the generosity and the support of its people to continue its vital work. Then in 2010, one of the buildings was taken out of service because of a fire. And then just a year later, in 2011, 2 of the buildings sustained some severe roof damage because of a windstorm. And then again, less than a year later in 2012, a water faucet on the second floor of one of the buildings broke loose and flooded down through the ceiling, flooding the kitchen, the office, ruining equipment and carpet and walls and ceilings and light fixtures. The amount of destruction that took place, coupled with the ongoing demands to proceed with ministry, and I want you to catch that, even when these things happened, ministry still has to take place. And the ongoing demands of ministry, coupled together with the devastation, can be overwhelming, and was overwhelming to the staff. Across our nation, we have churches and ministries that face struggles like this every day. We see this multiplied recently with the churches in Texas and Florida that have experienced the destruction from Hurricane Harvey. And even when insurance is available to rebuild, the funds are available to rebuild and restore, it is still a long and a stressful process that these ministries struggle to continue with ministry while they're trying to rebuild the broken walls. It's just those stresses are just as real for a church plant that is reaching out to people and needing a facility to minister in, an expansion project, a startup ministry, the needs to grow a facility while it's growing people, a building that's a facility that's suitable for their operations. Ephesians chapter 2 verse 10 says, "We are God's workmanship, created for good works in Christ Jesus, which He has prepared in advance for us to do." My wife Libby and I feel that these are some of the good works that God has prepared in advance for us to do. This may not be for everybody, but we have a clear and distinct calling that God wants us to travel down this road, to bring encouragement, to bring hands-on support and help facilities remodel, help them build new facilities, to help them expand, to help them with those construction things while they are also carrying on with ministry. I believe that these are the good works that God has prepared for us. Have you ever had one of those jobs when 2 hands just wasn't enough to get the job done? You needed a third hand? You needed just one more hand, one more person to lift what you needed to, or to hold things in place. I want you to think of U.S. MAPS, and that's what we represent. U.S. MAPS stands for Mission America Placement Service. I want you to think of U.S. MAPS as that third hand of ministry, that helping hand, that extra hand that you need from time to time to get the job done. You need that extra hand. There's three hands and three areas of U.S. MAPS that I want you just to be aware of this morning. The first one is church teams. And church teams are groups of people. It could be a group of men, it could be a group of women, it could be a group of families, it could be teenagers that get together from a church, and they make it their point to go to another place and help another church, another ministry. It may be with construction, it may be with other ministry needs, it may be with an outreach, a VBS, whatever those needs may be, that's what they're there for, to help with ministry. So there's church teams, and church teams can be raised up from within your church. It could be something that your church puts together to help another church, or it could be something that another church puts together to come and help you. So church teams, there's something that happens when you get a group of people together that stay together for an extended weekend, maybe 4 or 5 days, maybe a week, working on a project and facing the obstacles. Those group of people, they just grow close together. They have a shared experience, and it's great, it's healthy for churches to do this. The second hand, not just church teams, but the second hand is missionary associates. Missionary associates may not be full-time career missionaries, but they are interested in giving a part of their time, maybe a season, to ministry. Maybe it's a summer season at a campground. Maybe it's a year at another place, or up to 2 years where they could serve as in youth ministries, in children's ministries, administrative, the tasks that need to be done around a place, and they pitch in and help with that. And then the third place, not just church teams, missionary associates, but RVers. RV stands for recreation vehicle. That's how they travel, and that's where they stay while they are on site doing a construction project. RVers are men and women, couples, with a variety of professional, vocational backgrounds, and many of them are at or near retirement age, some of them much younger than retirement age, like me and like your pastor. But they are far from being retired. Even though they may be retirement age, they have a desire to invest their lives into serving purposefully. They may serve a few weeks to a month in a location. Some of them travel across the United States year-round. That's where they live all year, and they help with ministries, with construction projects and the like, with Assemblies of God Ministries. This includes some of the places where they help is our churches, our campgrounds, teen challenge centers, children's homes, Chi Alpha homes, our Bible colleges. And currently we have about 1,000 RVers across the United States. They're working on about 100 projects during the course of a year, and saving our ministries multiple millions of dollars in labor costs every year. And yet there is work. There is work for 1,000 more. There is work for many more. We could use more. While this ministry may take my wife and I anywhere in the United States, our focus is serving as missionaries in the north central region. And that includes Nebraska. That's Nebraska and northern Missouri and kind of everything north of there. Northern Missouri, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Upper Michigan, North and South Dakota, and back to Nebraska. So a large area that we'll be focused on ministering to, and helping to coordinate and recruit and manage the projects in that area. I told you of a ministry that experienced that devastation from a fire and a windstorm and a broken water pipe. And over the years, they worked to repair the damages. Contractors did the work that they could do, and that the volunteers were not equipped to do. But with volunteers from across the state and a platoon of RV MAPS volunteers and church teams, these buildings were restored to full use. The insurance proceeds funded much of the work, but with the labor savings, the money that they saved by the volunteers, enough money was available to accomplish some additional updates and upgrades and improvements on the facilities. Think of what could happen if our local ministries are strengthened and supported and positioned to effectively reach their communities and even to extend their impact beyond that into the mission field. We are inviting our churches and individuals to partner with us, with U.S. Maps, to build churches and to change lives. And to be an RV volunteer, you don't have to live all year long in your RV. You only need to give 2 weeks a year to a U.S. Maps construction site, or you may be interested in serving as a missionary associate in some place. We can find a place that's looking for somebody for a season of your life. Perhaps you would like to put a church team together to help build churches and to make some memories and to help minister to another community and another ministry. It can be life-changing for them, and it'll be life-changing for you. My wife and I have been called to serve U.S. Maps as full-time missionaries, building churches and changing lives. And for us to go, we need an army. We need a pile of volunteers, a team of volunteers and churches to partner with us. We're currently at about between 18 and 20% of our budget, our monthly budget, and we hope to raise 100% of our budget by the end of the year so that we can launch into this field by next spring, by this time next spring. In addition to one-time gifts, we really rely upon those who will pray daily and give monthly in a monthly faith promise. The churches oftentimes make a faith promise. Sometimes individuals do. And a faith promise is the foundation of support for our churches and our missionaries across the world. And for us, it's a commitment that you make to give monthly financial support to a missionary and to the ministry that as God enables you to do so. It's not a contract. You'll never receive a bill for that faith promise, but you do receive tax-deductible credit, receipt for everything that you give. I do have on the table over here, and I would encourage you to take some time to look at some of the projects that are here. There's some cards that are there. If you're interested in our newsletter, if you're interested in being an RV volunteer or a missionary associate or putting together a church team, if you're interested in taking us on as with a monthly faith promise, if you would just fill this out and check the box there, what you may be interested in then, and leave it there with at the table or with my wife, we would appreciate that. We'll stay in communication with you. We would love to recruit some of you to help us with some of our projects as well. The reason I speak so highly of U.S. Maps is because the ministry that I told you about that experienced the devastating damages is our own Nebraska District Campground in Lexington, Nebraska. And during those years, I was the director at that campground. I served there for 5 years, and we witnessed the devastation, but we also witnessed the miracles as God brought people on board to help repair the damages. He brought RVers, He brought church teams, He brought people that came and showed up and helped us restore these facilities. When the RVers arrived, when they stepped foot on campus, it was to me, as a camp director, and believe you me, we were overwhelmed. Some of this took place just right before camp started, and you have to get things together. When we saw the RVers arrive, it was as if Jesus Himself was stepping into our boat and calming our storm. And that's what we want to do. That's what my wife and I want to do for others. We want to launch out, and we want to help other people that may be experiencing a storm in their life and a devastating time in their life with their ministry and needing to construct something or repair something or remodel something. So we want to help them. That's part of what we will be doing as U.S. Maps missionaries. I have a video that I'm going to show you here. It's about 1.5 minutes long. It's about RV maps. And I want you to take notice that when they have these red vests on, I have one over here, but they have patches on those. And each of those patches represents a project that they've been on for at least 2 weeks. And every one of those maps, every one of those patches has a story to tell. So go ahead and roll that. Thank you. Maybe we'll get it. We can... Yeah, just move your cursor down to that, to the bottom. I think a play button will come up. And if it doesn't show, we'll move on.
This is on.
Okay.
There you go, right there. See the play button? Put it back over there.
Come on. Maybe we will. If we don't, we'll be fine. How many of you really want to see this? Yeah. Okay, we'll give it just a moment here. I'm going to be sharing this morning from the book of Nehemiah. If you have your Bibles, there we go. There we go.
Retirement. Where is that road taking you? Consider traveling with a purpose. For years, RV volunteers have traveled with a purpose. Many talents coming together to build churches and expand the kingdom. We create meeting places where children learn about God and adults know Him more deeply. Places where redemption and reconciliation are found. We build churches to change lives.
We know that buildings, when we build buildings, they are just a temporal facility. They're just for a time. But when we build churches and ministry centers, it's for an eternal purpose. And we would invite you to join with us in helping to build churches and change lives, building centers that will help influence people and change the lives of people across America. With U.S. Missions, we serve in the United States, and we're excited about that. Psalm chapter 133, verse 1 says, "How good and pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together in unity." And it goes on to say, it's there that the Lord bestows His blessing, even life forevermore. How many of you want the blessing of the Lord? Amen. Where does He bestow it? In unity. As people dwell together in unity in the body of Christ. When I was 16, 17 years of age, we were living in Alliance, Nebraska. I graduated from Alliance, Nebraska from high school. And while we were there, my dad, we built a church there. The church had outgrown its facility downtown and had a piece of property, and we built a church there. My dad was the general contractor for the job. And over the course of several years, we built the church with mostly volunteer labor from within the church. It takes a little longer to do things with volunteers, but it happens. And it was a great time of bringing people together. And I remember being up on the roof of that church, working with Brother Henderson. Brother Henderson was an older gentleman. He moved slower than me. I was a young kid that was wanting to get things done. And Brother Henderson moved a little bit slower. He was kind of, he wore those bib coveralls, which are comfortable. And he drove an old pickup, like an old Ford pickup, had those big wheel wells on the side. I'm guessing it was like a early 50s, 52, 53. One of those old Ford pickups had some wood sideboards on the side, and he'd pick up the wood scraps and the scrap things, and he'd take things home and burn them in his wood stove. And he was just kind of general all-around cleanup. And he and I got up on that roof, and we were working together to shingle. And how many of you know there's the right way to do things and the wrong way? Yeah. There's also a hard way to do things and an easy way. Well, here's the thing. If it's the right way and the hard way, that seemed to be the way my dad always picked. Yeah, but anyways, that's no disrespect, because he wanted to do things well. He wanted to do things right. About that time, air nailers were becoming popular, and air guns. And Dad said he wasn't comfortable with the way that air nailers nailed the nails and so we nailed them by hand. We did it the hard way. We did it the old-fashioned way. And I got good at hammering nails, those little 1.25" shingle nails, 3-tab shingles, and you'd hit and the lick, and you could kind of tap it and get it set. And then if you were good, you could hit it straight. You could get it in one shot, and sometimes 2, and sometimes 3, and sometimes more. But my dad said I drove nails like lightning. Never hit the same place twice. Yeah, some days are like that. But Brother Henderson and I, we were laying out shingles. He would help me. He was laying out the shingles and lining one edge up, and I'd line up the other and start nailing across. And we were team shingle. And then he got this idea. He'd hold a nail out here for me. He'd start holding nails out on that end of the shingle, and I'd tap it, and he'd move his hand, and I'd smack it in there, and we were getting along, making great time, and all of a sudden, I smacked his thumb. Oh, how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell together in unity. He could have gotten, it hurt, okay? His nail turned black. I don't remember if he lost the nail or not, but he didn't storm off the job. He didn't leave the job site. He didn't yell at me. He didn't use swear words. He continued to hold shingles and to hold nails. Now here's the thing, is he was a little more careful about holding nails. And here's the other side. I was a little more careful about hitting the nails. Sometimes when we work together as a church, we do things that might smack one another on the thumb. You might, when you work together in unity, you might hit somebody's thumb. And you might be the one that gets your thumb hit. That happens. Sometimes we're offended, and sometimes we're the offender. But how good and pleasant it is when we can forgive and work together and continue to hold nails for one another and to work together in unity. How good and pleasant it is when we dwell together in unity, for there the Lord bestows His blessing. I believe that's a little bit of what Nehemiah. In the book of Nehemiah, if you have your Bibles and you want to turn there, please do so. We'll be looking at several of the prayers of Nehemiah throughout the book of Nehemiah. So I'm not going to be in just one passage there. But Nehemiah was a man of prayer and of action. When I think of Nehemiah, I think of prayer and action. He was a man who prayed. We're going to look at some of the prayers and also some of the actions that were an outgrowth of that prayer. It is, when you think about prayer and action, I want you to think, a coin has two sides. There's a heads and a tails. And that's kind of what we need is prayer and action. There's two sides to that coin. It's important to pray, and I do not want to diminish that. Prayer is vital, it's key. But oftentimes we ignore the action side. And some of us are good at acting. We're good at the action and we forget to pray. But when you combine that together, it's a valuable thing. It's a worthwhile thing like a coin. It's worthwhile when both sides of the coin are stamped. Prayer and action. So when you see a coin, when you hold a coin, when you put a coin in Buddy Barrel, think of it as prayer and action working together. Let the coin that has value stamped on both sides. So Nehemiah, a man of prayer and action. Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 3, he's asking about things back home. How are things back home? What's it like back home? How many of you hear news from back home? If any of you, you're born and raised and you're still here in Falls City, you've never left Falls City? Anybody like that here? A few of you, okay? Others of you came from somewhere else and moved here. And so you like to know what's happening back home. Once in a while you call somebody from back home and you ask about the news. Well, Nehemiah was in exile in Babylon under King Artaxerxes, and he asks about what's it like back home. And here's the message that he gets. Those who survived the exile are back in the province, and at least you could say, at least they survived. But survived for what? They're back in the province and things are not any better. That's kind of the story he gets. They're in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. There's trouble, there's disgrace, there's brokenness, there's destruction. Perhaps there's a time in your life when you have great trouble. and destruction. It may seem like you're going through disgrace. It may seem like your life is broken beyond repair. Maybe you know some people whose walls are broken down and gates are burned and their lives are in disgrace. Perhaps you see the trouble and disgrace in your own family or in your workplace or in our nation. That's the report that Nehemiah heard. That's the report from back home. Well, here's his response in verse 4. When I heard these things, I sat down and I wept for some days, and I mourned and I fasted and I prayed before the God of heaven. He mourned and he fasted, he prayed, he sat down because it was overwhelming to him what was happening from back home. The news was so overwhelming, he couldn't help but sit down and cry and weep because of the situation. And I want to challenge you this morning in your heart. When was the last time that God moved so heavily upon you? Maybe because of your situation, maybe because of somebody else. You were moved with such compassion, such agony in spirit that you actually cried, or that you actually took time to pray, or to fast and to pray and to mourn and weep because of the situation in somebody's life. I pray, God, help us to understand that there's a world around us that's undergoing things that are agonizing, and they need the hand of God in their life. They need a voice of encouragement. They need somebody to come and help them rebuild the walls. And Nehemiah saw the need back home, and he mourned and he fasted and he prayed and he wept for those people. Oh God, help them. And during those times of prayer, I believe that God began to birth something in his heart, in his life, a vision as he began to pray for his hometown. This was one of the longest prayers. I'm not going to read through it throughout that first chapter of Nehemiah, but it's one of the longest prayers of Nehemiah. And as you get to the end of that prayer in about verse 9, we see the promise. We heard the report, we saw his response, now we see the promise. Here's the promise. God says, if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. After you've seen the trouble and you've wept and you've mourned and you've prayed and you've fasted for somebody, it's time to lift up your eyes to the promise that God gives. And here's what God says. It doesn't matter how far away they've been removed, I can bring them home. The farthest horizon. Do you know where the farthest horizon is? For some people, the farthest horizon is Fall City. There's some people who have wandered far from God and they live in Fall City. And there's some people who live even farther away. But when you drive in these roads in Nebraska, you can fix your eyes on a horizon. And you drive to it, and when you get there, what do you see? Another horizon. And another horizon. And another. How far is the farthest horizon? How far is the farthest? It seems to be indefinite, doesn't it? And so the answer to me, what it tells me, is that it does not matter how far a person wanders off course, how far they've gone, how far they've drifted. Some people have only drifted at one horizon. Maybe they're only 2 horizons from where they should be. But some people have drifted to the farthest horizon, and they seem to be a lost cause. Do you know anybody that seems to be a lost cause? Well, here's the promise of God. It doesn't matter how far the farthest horizon is. He says, I can bring them home. I can bring them home. And if you're here this morning and you've drifted many horizons away, I want you to hear the word of God that says, I can bring you back home. If you will turn to me, I will restore you. I will bring you home. I will bring you to the place where I want you to be. I'm able to restore you. Nehemiah was praying for his people who were far from home. And even though they were there, God still needed to restore them. Well, here's an opportunity that's given. When God has placed something in his heart, Nehemiah wanted to see his people restored. He wanted to see the walls rebuilt and the gates restored. In Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 4 and 5, he'd been praying, he'd been mourning, he'd been fasting, he'd been weeping, and then he goes back to work. Because he's the cupbearer for the king, and he's got to show up. And he's got to do what a cupbearer does. He shows up and he stands before the king and he shows up for work, whether it's a month later or 2 weeks later or a day later, and he's not looking too good. His heart is heavy, and the king picks up on this. The king was close enough to his cupbearer that he recognized that there was something stirring in Nehemiah that was just a little different. And he says, Nehemiah, there's a heaviness about you. And all I can explain it is that there's a heaviness of heart. What's going on? Here's the opportunity. Here's the opportunity Nehemiah has been praying about. Here's the opportunity that has come to him. And he says in chapter 2, verse 4 and 5, the king says to me, what is it you want? What is it you want? What is it you want? I want to pose that question to you today. At the end of service, I want to bring us there. What is it you want? What is it you want God to do for you? What is it you want our King to do to you? If God were to ask you, what is it you want? What would you tell him? Nehemiah stands before the king, and it says he prayed to the God of heaven in verse 4 and 5, and I answered the king. He prayed and he took action. He prayed and answered the king. If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried so that I can rebuild it. This is kind of one of those silent prayers. It's not a lengthy prayer, but it's one of those, God help me now. One of those, I'm on the spot and I need God's hand. Nehemiah had been praying about this already, but here he prays and he answers the king. And he says, this is what I'd like to see. He had something in his heart that he shared with the king. And the king says, what's it going to take? How long will it take? What will it take? And Nehemiah was prepared for this. God had birthed something in his heart. He said, the king, I need timbers from the hills. And I have a purchase order. If you'll sign it, I can get those timbers to rebuild the gates. And I need workers. And I need people to go with me so that I can pass safely, so that my entourage of people can get to Jerusalem safely without harm. And I need the time, and this amount of time. And he was there, and he offered the king what he wanted. And the king signed off on it and sent him on his way. Nehemiah had that coin in his pocket, and he spent it. He prayed and asked the king. In chapter 2, verse 12, you see Nehemiah back in Jerusalem, in his homeland, and the vision is beginning to be birthed in him. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 12, it says, I set out during the night with a few men, but I had not told anyone what God had put in my heart. That's the vision. That's where vision starts. It's in the heart. He says, at this point, I hadn't shared with anyone except the king what God had put in my heart. And he goes around Jerusalem and he's assessing the situation and thinking, what can we do to rebuild these walls? In verse 16, it says, the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or the nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. And then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in. And they all said, no duh. You think they had not seen the trouble they were in? I dare say it was probably the topic of conversation at the local coffee shop on a regular basis when they would get together and say, do you see the trouble we're in? The walls are broken down. The gates have been destroyed with fire. Somebody ought to do something. Somebody ought to do something. How many times had they probably heard that? And Nehemiah was opening the same way. You see the gates that are burned with fire. You see the walls broken down. Somebody ought to do something. Let's do it. Come and let us rebuild. In Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 18, it says, then they replied, yes, let's do that. Let's start rebuilding. And so they began this good work. Well, sometimes when you start something good, when you start something big, sometimes people don't appreciate it. You share your vision and you get people together and you start on the path, and not everybody wants to get on board. Sometimes there's opposition to that. Sometimes people don't want to see you be successful. Sometimes people don't want to see you accomplish your dream. Well, it's no different here. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 7 and 8. There's opposition. When Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs, now I want you to just say those two names. I want you to be familiar with them. Sanballat and Tobiah. Sanballat, now do not call each other Sanballat and Tobiah. But understand that sometimes when you want to do something for God, there's a Sanballat and a Tobiah that will stand in opposition to it. Sanballat and Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, the men of Ashdod, heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, and they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble. If we can't defeat them by fighting against them, we're going to stir up trouble and divide and conquer. We want this work to come to stop. We don't want them to rebuild the wall. We don't want them to rebuild the gates. When I was in grade school, I grew up in Casper, Wyoming, and if you think the wind blows here, it definitely blows there. It blows every day, and it's just a question of which direction. But we lived about 1.5 miles from the grade school, and that was great. When the bus would pick us up, we were kind of out at the end of the route, and it'd pick us up, and it was a few stops down and drop us off at the grade school. It was an easy ride to school, but coming home, it would pick us up first at the grade school and then go across town to the middle school and then clear across town the other way to the high school and then start taking people home, and we were about the last stop. So it could be about 1.5 hours till we got home. And it's 1.5 miles away, and we could walk faster than that. So a lot of times we walked. About a half mile up to the peak of a hill, or a water tower was, and you could see from the top of that hill across to where a house was, but you couldn't see the house. But it was kind of a downhill and an uphill, so there's kind of this valley, long, slow valley. Well, just down towards the bottom of this valley, I call this the Valley of Shadow and Death. Because on the right side of the road, when I'd get down towards the bottom of this hill, there was on the right side of the road, there was a junkyard. It was a small junkyard, about a city block. But you know what junkyards have? Junkyard dogs. And this junkyard had a junkyard dog, and it was a big German Shepherd. And oftentimes it was behind the fence, and it would just bark at you and growl at you and tear the fence apart trying to get to you. And sometimes it was in the house right next to it, and you could just hear it ripping the door apart. And so I'd get real careful when I approached that, and I'd walk quiet and try not to turn any rocks and try not to make any extra noise and hope that the wind was in the right direction so he didn't smell me. But every now and then that dog was sitting out on the front porch. Didn't matter how quiet you were. And he'd come out and he'd greet me. And sometimes that greeting wasn't so much fun. He'd come out and greet me, and he'd big German Shepherd dog, and I'm a grade school